Please be seated. Has anyone seen this internet meme floating around, maybe on your Facebook stream or your Twitter feed? It goes like this: that love thy neighbor thing, I meant that. Signed, God. Now, rumor has it that this was originally a billboard campaign sometime in the 1980s. And, you know, the internet, so lots of different stories, but perhaps in Florida or Kentucky, but somewhere in the South. A couple of different denominations claim its origin. But whatever the original place that this came from, I think it lives on in social media because, well, it's simple, it's challenging, it's to the point, and it really makes you just stop and think, doesn't it? Well, Jesus in today's gospel is going for that same kind of impact. Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all of the law and the prophets." So here we are. We've had weeks and weeks of enigmatic parables about the kingdom and how we are supposed to live in light of its coming. And finally, we get it. A straightforward, clear statement. None of those mysterious allusions to vineyards and coins, just those plain talking facts. You see, if the test were tomorrow and the question came up, what does God ask of us? Then this is it. We now know the answer and we could pass the test, right? Well, isn't this just what was going on in the story? You see, this isn't Jesus preaching or teaching. Matthew tells us in the start of today's gospel that, in fact, Jesus is the one who's being tested. This is, in fact, the last in a series of tests. We heard one of them last week. But the members of the religious establishment in Jerusalem are testing Jesus. And you know what? Jesus is successfully passing all of their tests. The thing is, these members of the religious establishment are challenged. They've been challenged by Jesus's preaching. Their status and their honor is being called into question in their society because their sense of what's right and wrong is being put to the test by Jesus. Some saw him as dangerous, and they wanted to strike back. They wanted to find a way to taint his growing authority as a teacher and a prophet. So they come up with this great question. It's a classic one. Which commandment of the law is the greatest? Now, it's designed by the Pharisees to be a trick question. The thing is, they don't anticipate what Jesus is going to do because Jesus just gives them the simple and the expected answer, which is really not what Jesus ever does. Jesus passes the test. He toes the line. He recites the commandments just as they're found in the Torah in Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. Jesus makes this simple statement, and then he moves on to a completely different counter challenge on a totally different subject. So could this be so straightforward, so basic that it needs absolutely no elaboration? Is loving God and loving our neighbor that easy to understand? Well, Jesus seems to think so, but I don't always find it to be the case. I mean, why else would that meme be so enduring unless it was something that was both intuitively resonant to us, but also so challenging when it comes to the actual application in our lives? What was so foundational in Jesus's time remains very much at the basis of our own lives and faith. And it seems simple on the surface, but what does it mean actually to love our neighbor as ourself? as we are trying to be disciples of Christ. You see, for our culture, love is a feeling. It's an emotion of elation. It's passionate. It has power. It can cause us to do incredible things, both for good or for evil. Love carries this meaning for us, whether we're talking about romantic love, loving our children, loving our close friends. It's there. It's really powerful and strong. Just watch a television show. It's always at the root of something. Is this what Jesus meant by love? Probably not. So what is the concept of love that is so simply laid before us as our foundation of a godly life? Well, if we look more closely at the commandments that Jesus is referring to from the Torah, it gives us a great clue. Actually, it's that first commandment that Jesus quotes about how to love God that elaborates and teases this out for us. It gives us 3 ways to love God: with our heart, with our soul, and with our mind. This is what is referred to as the Shema. It is the foundation of the covenant for the Jews with their relationship to God. And it calls them into love with God with their whole selves. But we have to be careful in terms of how we read this, because for the ancient Jewish people, the concepts of heart and soul and mind aren't just this internal thing in the same way that we would think of them. In fact, in the Jewish understanding of the self, heart was not just the center of feeling, but it was also the center of thought. So it kind of combines some of those things, thought and feeling. Soul, on the other hand, was an outward expression of life. It's sometimes referred to as ruah, or breath, but is the thing that actually puts us into motion and being in action in the world. Mind, on the other hand, is not so much about thoughts, but about our purposeful action, the way that we actually go about things in the world. So this kind of love that God is talking about encompasses everything that we are and do. It's what's inside us, but also what comes out of us in word and action. We think it, we feel it, we speak it, we live it. It's there in everything we do. It's a love that has to be seen outwardly in action. Now, I think that you can get a great poetic description of this kind of love if you go back to the very first psalm in the book of Psalms, right back to the beginning of that book in your Bible, because it ties us all together. It tells us that those who live the law are like trees that are planted by streams of water, bearing fruit in due season, with leaves that do not wither. I think this gives a really good sense of how the ancient Israelites see this kind of love as rooted deeply in God, but also bearing a fruit that spreads out into the world and can feed and nurture all. There's an external result that remains and sustains life for all. Now, in Jesus's time, too, love was less of an internal emotion and more of an outward thing, but it had a really strong sense of affiliation with a person or a group. Love meant, first and foremost, obligations of a mutual nature for nurture, for loyalty, whether between kin and master, between dependent, and all of those different ways that the communities were knit together. This kind of love is also active. It's about a web of life that sustains activities that all of the members of the group fulfill for each other. Are we so far from this concept of love? Maybe not. I mean, I remember when I was a parent having to change all those diapers on my newborn infant. I remember standing there and thinking, this is really love. I felt the same way when I was caring for my father, who was on hospice in his last days before he was dying last year. I think sometimes it's hard for us to remember when we are doing the laundry or paying our elders' parents' bills or filling in for a work colleague that is sick. But this is love. The Old Testament stretches that concept of affiliation by reminding the Jewish people over and over again that the biblical concept of this affiliation love isn't limited just to family or group, but it has to extend to those who are found outside that web of nurture and connection. The Bible calls out over and over again that the resident aliens, the widows, the orphans, the poor, they're also part of this web of nurture. This is the love that we are commanded to live both within and without. It's active. It's a relationship of care that extends even to those that we do not know or count as part of our family or our circle or our community. In today's reading, Paul makes the same point when he's talking to that Christian community that he founded in Thessalonica. Paul writes, "We were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children." Paul is telling them that sharing the gospel was not merely about demonstrating good behavior, but it was also about entering into a relationship with them that was loving and nurturing, just like those family and kin connections. Even though they were strangers and Paul came from another place, this is how he came to them. So if this love of God and neighbor that we are commanded into is active, then what should we be doing today? How do we know what it means in a world where our own opportunities to love are so much broader than just widows and orphans in our midst? Another more recent popular church sign that I do know for a fact comes from All Souls Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., because they're selling it. You can put it up in churches all over the place, and it started to appear in the last year or two. Puts it like this: love your neighbor who doesn't look like you, think like you, love like you, speak like you, pray like you, or vote like you. Love your neighbor, no exceptions. Now, when you put it like that, it is not simple at all. In fact, it's incredibly challenging. It's the spiritual work of a lifetime. I mean, look at this list again. You have to love people who don't look like you, think like you, pray like you, vote like you. I mean, maybe we can get a handle on one or two of these things, but some of them are really tough. I mean, I will freely admit that I am struggling with that love your neighbor who doesn't vote like you thing right now, as I'm sure a lot of us are. So where are the role models, the saints of today, the heroes of the faith that can give us a concrete example of how to love in this way? Well, next week, we'll be celebrating the Feast of All Saints, and that's our chance to reflect on who has filled these kinds of roles for us in our walk of faith. One role model that's been really important for me in terms of living out this kind of active love of neighbor in the world, and who has been there through probably most of my life and kind of continued to reappear in surprising ways, has been Jimmy Carter. He's one of my heroes in the spiritual discipline of loving your neighbor. Now, I think he's someone who takes the love commandment seriously as a foundation for the action in his life. He was the first president that I remember being elected, and though I was only in middle school at the time, I clearly recall the miracle peace that he brokered between Egypt and Israel at Camp David. But you know what? I really understood what he was about while I was living in Africa in the early 1990s. My only source of news at that time was a radio broadcast from the BBC World Service that came into my hut on my shortwave radio. It was a time just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there was this incredible spirit of optimism sweeping the planet, of trying to find a way for countries that had been in conflict and under military regimes for years to transition to peaceful democracy and free and fair elections. Jimmy Carter's name came up over and over on those daily newscasts that were playing on my shortwave radio. They talked about parts of the world that I had rarely ever heard about in the American press, emerging from years and years of conflict. And you know what? It seemed to me that Jimmy was always there, advocating for peaceful, free, fair elections, as well as the basic things that people needed: clean water and the end of poverty and disease. But it was really at the point where South Africa, which we were surrounded by, the border was just 6 miles from my village, it was right at the point when South Africa started to look like it might also find a way to have an election that included the Black majority and that was free and fair. It was right at that point when a lot of people in the country and the world feared that this might not be able to happen because also there was incredibly escalating political violence. I remember conversations among all of my fellow Peace Corps volunteers where we would say, we want Jimmy to come. He'll make this election work. We had so much faith in the power and the effect of his actions in all the ways that we had heard about them. The Nobel Prize for Peace is one of the closest things in our contemporary global secular culture to beatification. And I'm glad that someone who has lived his faith in this way could be recognized on the world stage. So, can we act like this? Can we, through our personal prestige and ability to organize, motivate other people to tackle those hard issues about free elections and democracy and poverty and conflict all over the world? I mean, probably not with that kind of global impact, but to be fair, none of us has the advantage of having once been president of the United States. But when we look at Jimmy Carter and others like him, at base, we simply see people for whom the love commandment steers the direction of their actions. Whenever an opportunity is placed before them, they know the choice to make. Now, we may or may not be heroes of the faith in this kind of grand scale, but we all have our own ways to act in love that are set before us each day. How do we find ways to act in love in our own context? How do we draw our sense of affiliation and obligation so that it includes all? Well, I think one way is this: we can start by carrying with us, as we go through our days, these simple words of prayer. Lord, these are my neighbors. How am I called to act in love? You see, whenever we're faced with a person who doesn't look like us, or think like us, or vote like us, instead of reacting in frustration or anger or fear, we can pray those words. We can pray them under our breath, and then we can listen for God's voice telling us how we are called to act in love in that particular moment. Lord, these are my neighbors. How am I called to act in love? Because you know what? It's that love thy neighbor thing. I meant that. Signed, God.